Today on Better Book Clubs, tips for reading Pride and Prejudice. The novelist Jane Austen was born in 1775 in Hampshire in England, and she was the daughter of a rector whose family was well connected but not rich, according to the introduction to my copy of Pride and Prejudice, which I'll talk about in a minute. By the time she was 19, she had drafted the first version of her novel Sense and Sensibility, and the following year she had drafted the early version of Pride and Prejudice, which is perhaps her most famous novel today. By the time she was writing these novels, her father had died, and she and her mother had moved into a house in Chawton, which was owned by one of her brothers, and that house is actually still standing today and is open to the public as a Jane Austen museum, and I'll leave a link for that below in the comments section for you. Sense and Sensibility was finally published in 1811, and after that, Austen published novels at the rate of about one a year until her death in 1817. She was only 41 years old. She wrote 6 novels in all, but they were all published anonymously in her lifetime, and in fact, again, in this copy that I have, there's a facsimile of the original title page, and she's listed, it just simply says, by the author of Sense and Sensibility. So it wasn't until after her death, when her last couple of novels were published posthumously, that her brother Henry actually put her name out there as the author of these, at that point, already popular novels. I think one of the reasons this novel has withstood the test of time to be made into movies and spin-off books and theatrical productions is that it has a very recognizable plot line even today. So the arc of the romantic story is recognizable to us from rom-coms and romantic novels, and Austen certainly had something to do with setting the standard for that, but I think it makes the book absolutely readable today for that reason. I had also forgotten until I reread it recently that it's a really funny book. There are lots of actually laugh out loud moments, particularly in the interactions between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, the parents of the main character, Elizabeth Bennet. So don't be surprised or think that you're reading wrong if you find something in this novel funny. For those of you who've never read Pride and Prejudice before, as I always do when I'm talking about classics, I want to give you a few tips for reading this early 19th century novel. The first is not to be intimidated by it. Some people feel like, oh, if something is a classic, it must be hard, but Pride and Prejudice is not a hard book to read. So go into it expecting to be able to read it and just enjoy the reading. You may come across some places where the 19th century language slows you down a little bit, so be willing to be slowed down. I found that there were spots where the dialogue was kind of dense and I had to stop and pay attention. Austen is kind of giving her theme through the dialogue of some of the characters. As when you're reading any classic, you really want to pay attention to what edition you're reading. And the reason for that is that these older books are all out of copyright. So any publisher who wants to make a buck and knows that they can sell copies of Pride and Prejudice can throw together an edition and put it out there in the bookstore. But not every edition is created equal. So this happens to be a Penguin Classics edition. That's a good brand to look for. The Modern Library is another one. Oxford is a good one. The Longman Cultural Series is good. What you'll find in these copies is that there tends to be a sort of scholarly introduction that gives you some background, and this one also has an essay in the end. It will have footnotes to help you out, so when you come across some cultural reference that you're not sure about, if you want, you can go in the back and look it up. I actually didn't even do that on this reading. I just kind of let those things breeze by, but I knew that I could look them up in the back in the notes if I wanted to have a deeper reading of it. This copy also explains that, there are usually different versions of the text of an older book like this. So choices have to be made about what's printed. And this particular edition, it says, is based on the text of the first edition. Obvious typographical errors and errors of grammar and punctuation have been corrected, but no attempt has been made to standardize or modernize the text. That's really helpful to know because some of those choices might be made differently in different editions. So So understand that you have some choices, and it's always best to pick one of those trusted editions when you're reading a classic. I've consulted my daughter, who with her friends has some pretty strong opinions about the movies and the book. I haven't watched any of the movies in a long time, so their recommendation, which I'll pass on to you, is that the 1995 BBC series, it's 6 episodes, with Colin Firth playing the role of Mr. Darcy, is very faithful to the novel, but maybe not as lifelike or as spirited as the 2005 movie that stars Keira Knightley as Elizabeth Bennet. So the movies, just like different editions of the books, are going to present the story differently. And you want to be reading the book for yourself and drawing your own conclusions and having your own experience, and then go off and watch the movie for fun. Above all, just enjoy your reading of this great classic novel by Jane Austen. It's a fun summer read because it's pretty easy to read as far as classics go, and then you could tack on the film at the end and watch that with your book club as well. If you like what you're seeing here, please subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.